So, hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture about Machiavelli. This lecture will tell a tale of two cities. One city is a principality and is moved by its will to glory. The other city is more peace-loving and strives for after non-domination. This second city is a republic. The author which we'll discuss today has written two very important books on these forms of political organization. The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, respectively. In this lecture, we'll first discuss each book in isolation, and then we'll attempt to reconcile the accounts and come to a communal interpretation of Machiavellian's thought. But for now, let's start with The Prince. At first glance, The Prince might look as a rather conventional book, but the careful reader will notice that it is not a customary work and arguably even has a revolutionary character. We find this in the structure of the first three chapters of the book already. In chapter 1, Machiavelli asserts that there are two kinds of states, the republic and the principality, and that only the latter will be upon consideration in the rest of the book. In chapter 2, he makes a distinction between hereditary and newly acquired principalities. And that in the hereditary principalities, quote, he, that is the prince, will always maintain his state unless some extraordinary and inordinate force deprives him of it. And this is the last chapter, meaning that it's easy to maintain it and maintain his position. So, the discussion on hereditary princes is about to end there for a big part. In chapter 3, the discussion on these newly acquired principalities starts. And this will be the main focus of the remainder of the book. So even though the book The Prince was dedicatory to Lorenzo de' Medici and intended to ingratiate Machiavelli, note that Lorenzo de' Medici was actually a customary prince and is therefore not the subject of the book. The subject of this book is the new prince. So what is this new prince and how should we understand him? These new princes are men like Moses and Romulus, and there are more examples in Machiavelli's writing about these men in antiquity. But the key feature here is that they basically founded their people. In creating their dominion, they were able to both shape the form and the constitution of their regime. Note the Aristotelian language which is used here. And these men did not only shape their people, but they also made it a successful people. The condition for this success, and what we'll emphasize throughout this discussion, can be framed in the context of chapter 25. And this will focus more specifically on the following quote. In chapter 25, Machiavelli says, I conclude, therefore, that since fortune changes and men remain set in the ways, men will succeed when the two are in harmony, and fail if they are not in accord. I am certainly convinced of this, that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and it is necessary in order to keep her down, to beat her, and to struggle with her. And it is seen that she most often allows herself to be taken over by men who are impetuous rather than those who make cold advances. Now repeat one section again. Because fortune is a woman and it is necessary in order to keep her down, to beat and struggle with her. At the end of the discussion on the prince, we should be able to make sense of this line. So we'll use this as key to understanding Machiavelli. Now let's break it apart. So what kind of prince are we talking about here? Because we're speaking in a language which personifies fortune as a woman, and not just as a woman, but as a woman that needs to be beaten to even add oil to the fire. Our book translates as skill, for which Machiavelli uses the Italian word virtù. which has its Latin root in the word vir, meaning man. So Machiavellian virtu, which translates as virtue, normally could also be translated as manly. And this interpretation seems to be a stronger one than skill, because the opposite of virtu in Machiavelli is often denoted as effeminate. So we definitely got the politically correct translation in our course book. But more importantly, what kind of man is this? When you identify fortune as a woman needs to be beaten by manliness. So this might bring you to what we normally think of Machiavelli to be, right? A preacher of evil. But is this all there is, or is there more to the man? So is the good prince who beats fortune necessarily a morally bad person? For this, we need to delve deeper into this concept of virtu in Machiavelli's Prince. And in this regard, it can be important to have a look at chapter 15 of the Prince, from which I'll quote, "Now there remains to be examined what should be the methods and procedures of a prince in dealing with his subjects and friends. And because I know that many have written about this, I am afraid that by writing about it again, I shall be thought of as presumptuous, since in discussing this material, I depart radically from the procedures of others. But since my intention is to write something useful for anyone who understands it, it seems more suitable to me to search after the effectual truth of the matter, rather than its imagined one. And many writers have imagined for themselves republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For there is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live, that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wishes to profess goodness at all times will come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how to not be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity." So I know this is a rather lengthy quote, so let's break it down. What's being said here? Well, there are multiple motives in this piece of text that are worth paying attention to. You find here his departure from the ethics which is mostly followed at his time. So this ethics in Machiavelli is mostly associated with the amoralist nature of his political writing, and then the corresponding move to realpolitik. This is based on his rejection of the Christian mentality at the time, so a motive of suffering and duty, as this will not be beneficial, but also a rejection of these ideal type of governments, or a way of thinking about politics in terms of ideal types, in which we'll see a direct critique of Plato and his imagined republic. Right? We should not think about republics that have never been seen but only imagined. But accordingly, and in this ethical position, also the writings of Aquinas and Augustine are rejected by Machiavelli's view and interpretation on politics. So we need to learn how to not be good and be concerned with the effectual truths of the matter rather than moral ideas. Yet it would do an injustice to Machiavelli's thought if we would see his teaching as purely political pragmatism. When looking at his individual discussions on generosity, blame, fear, cruelty, he does not simply put forward a maxim stating that ends ought to justify the means. There is a sense of a transformation of how these virtues or values should be understood. And transvaluation, some of you might know, is a Nietzschean term which has to do with a reorientation of our moral landscape. So what sets Machiavelli apart from his predecessor Aristotle, for example, who also has an account of virtue ethics, is that he grounds his concepts of virtue, in extreme situations. A coup d'etat, war, regime changes, conspiracies, and he takes these extreme situations at his starting point and makes his morality fit these conditions, in which the very survival of the state or the independence of society is at stake. In these situations, the conventions of ordinary morality need to be overstepped, and here the prince needs to know how to not be good. So there is definitely an idea of a morality in here which goes beyond mere pragmatism. And this points to another distinction between the employment of the concepts between Machiavelli and Aristotle. So the very possibility of virtue in Machiavelli grows out of a context of chaos and disorder, where in Aristotle we saw that the possibility for virtue exists within entering politics, and therefore seeking a pragmatic middle way and moderation within the state, which guarantees that this condition or natural condition for politics is satisfied. So the bigger Machiavellian point that can be made here out of this relationship between what virtue is and that it comes out of order and disorder and chaos is that good itself is not only the opposite of bad, but that bad is an antecedent to the good. So there is a prioriness of badness. Good as a concept is founded upon evil. It should therefore not surprise us that the birth of principalities come out of murder and violence. Think about the people that we just talked about in the beginning. Romulus is famous for killing his brother. And also Abraham has made sacrifices, or was asked to make sacrifices. Moses in the beginning was asked to make sacrifices. So therefore Machiavelli, in this context, or understood in this way, Machiavelli is not committed to claiming that in ordinary times of politics, ordinary rules of justice do not apply. But the idea for him is that the really virtuous prince is one that manages to navigate or bring good order out of this chaos. And that's why there's an extraordinary moral condition in place, and that's where he places or grounds his concept of virtue on. So, focusing in on this violent part, why do we have to beat and struggle with fortune rather than just knowing how to overcome her? What does his use of this violent language tell us? This leads us to explore the problem of dirty hands in politics. The first instance of why this violence is necessary we find in chapter 16 of The Prince, which is the chapter chapter 6, which is the chapter on the new principalities acquired by one's own arms and skill, which we said should be translated, or is the translation of the Italian word virtu. In this chapter, Machiavelli talks about armed prophets. A prophet is not an ordinary kind of being. A prophet is someone who inspires and shapes the ideas and laws given to people. Yet, he says, these prophets need to be armed. So there is a necessity for weapons. And I quote from his passage, people are fickle by nature, and it is simple to convince them of something, but difficult to hold them in that conviction. And therefore, affairs should be managed in such a way that when they no longer believe that they can, in such a way that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force. From this, we can also deduce why the prophet that founded empires only by teaching is not mentioned by Machiavelli. Because the obvious answer here would have been Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a prophet that gave rise to one of the main religious institutions in the world. His religious institute, or his religion, grew out to be one of the biggest, and there have been many empires, most notably the Roman Empire, which was shaped based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. Yet we do not find him along the list of admirable characters given by Machiavelli who should have started their own peoples. But there are a lot of other religious figures, especially Old Testament, mentioned by him. So there is a need for violence, but within the proper proportion, so in the context of virtue. The same idea can be found in Machiavelli's retelling of the story of David and Goliath. In chapter 13 of The Prince, Machiavelli's account of this story, David does not only carry his sling into battle, as in the biblical story, but he is also carrying a knife. So David himself has been armed by Machiavelli. The idea is here a critique of a kind of piety as sole means of achieving political leadership. So good leadership means that also the leader has to be able to rely on his own strength, the knife, when other ideals fail. Yet the most clear account of a good prince and the problem of dirty hands can be found in not the prince itself, but in one of the poems which Machiavelli wrote. And the poem is called Ambizione, or Ambition, in which he laments his countrymen's lack of spirit, or thumos, as Plato would have called it, and their need to be re-educated into the art of war. And I will quote one passage from this poem to give you an idea. The poem itself is rather lengthy, what he means with this. If you perchance are tempted to accuse nature, if Italy, so weary and wounded, does not produce hard and bellicose people, this, I say, is not sufficient to erase our cowardice, for education can supplement where nature is deficient. Stern education made Italy bloom in the ancient days, and made her rise and conquer the entire world, and for herself make room. But now she lives, if tears can be called life, beneath the ruins, an unhappy fate that she has reaped from her long lack of strife. But now she lives, if tears can be called life, beneath the ruins, an unhappy fate that she has reaped from her long lack of strife. In this poem, he accuses his countrymen of having grown soft due to the wrong kind of education. Yet setting the topic of education aside for discussion here, the message seems to be, if you want liberty, you have to be tough, you have to be manly, you have to have virtue. Or in other words, you have to know how to not be good when necessary. The Christian idea of being good needs to be rejected. You have to learn how to get your hands dirty if you want to be a good politician, according to Machiavelli. Between the innocence of the Christianity and the worldliness of Machiavelli's new morality, there can be no reconciliation. The ability of the prince's subjects to live in peace depends on the prince's clear-eyed and sometimes ruthless use of power. So this is why fortune needs to be beaten and struggled with, rather than overcome. So the indication of violent language seems to tell us that we need to know how to use cruelty and force. Cruelty, when used well, is a virtue. So as said before, moral goodness grows out of a required context of evil. High-minded insistence on morality will lead to the ruin of this political society. However, keep in mind that before we have already established that this counts for these extraordinary or extreme situations, right? How good is based upon evil. Machiavelli is not necessarily committed to the rejection of an ordinary standard of justice in ordinary situations of peace. Yet then his education needs to maintain some of this thumos or spiritedness within the population. But we said that we would sidestep this issue. So now we have gathered all the pieces to synthesize an understanding of the quote that we started out with and said that would have the key to understanding Machiavelli's Prince. Because fortune is a woman and it's necessary in order to keep her down, to beat and struggle with her. We have stated that the subject of the book is the new prince, those who created their states ex nihilo, out of nothing. The men like Moses and Romulus, as said in chapter 6, received nothing from fortune except the opportunity, which gave them the material they could mold into whatever form they desired. And without opportunity, the strength of their spirit would have been extinguished. And without that strength, the opportunity would have come in vain. These princes have gotten the opportunity by fortune, but they were able to seize it effectively because of their virtue, or manly virtue, or criminal virtue, or plainly skill, whichever name you want to use. Because as we read in chapter 25, the prince that gains his dominion solely by fortune will lose it by fortune. But those who have the virtue to shape their states themselves will be able to hold on to it longer. This mastering of fortune is what glory means. And according to Machiavelli, the aim of every prince should be the achievement or pursuit of glory. I hope that this gives you a clear understanding of what the general line of reasoning is as being found in the Prince. So we said that we could consider both works in isolation. So let's now turn to the other work, the Discourses on Livy. The Discourses have often been seen as Machiavelli's work on republics, as alluded to in the beginning of the Prince. Remember, in the preface of the Prince, he says that, or in chapter 1 of the Prince, he says that he will deal with republics on another occasion. When he wrote that, he was already working on the Discourses, and it's commonly held to be that the Discourses is this other place where he deals with his work on republics. And the book itself takes the form of Machiavelli's commentary on the history of Rome as written down by Titus Livy, hence the title of his work. So this book might occasionally read a bit pragmatic, and the chapters can jump from one place to another. But understanding Machiavelli's humanism can help us in contextualizing this. The common defining feature of humanists is to draw moral lessons from a selective retelling or a complete retelling of history, and thereby informing our actions today. You'll find this new humanistic commitments in the prefaces of the books as given in your excerpts. So that those who read what I have to say may the more easily draw those practical lessons which one should seek to obtain from the study of history. I am sorry, I hope that the church bells will not interfere too much, but this should be over relatively soon. So this book is seen as his work on republics, as the main topic in it is actually the role of the people in politics. And the people here are seen responsible for maintaining the liberty that is at the core of a republican regime. This revived sense of classical republicanism rallies behind the cultivation of civic virtues in a citizenry and orienting towards the common good. In this regard, there is a high esteem for the rule of law and well-ordered public institutions in order to keep the people orientated towards the common good rather than their individual or fractional interests. Within this tradition, and as common in this tradition, Machiavelli supports a mixed regime, if you want to use the Aristotelian language again. So Machiavelli makes his argument is heavily influenced and also directly comments on Aristotle's 6 types of regimes. And like Aristotle, he thinks that it is more desirable to have a mixed regime rather than one of these 6 pure forms. As he says in Book 1, Chapter 2, I maintain then that all forms of government mentioned above are far from satisfactory. The 3 good ones, because their life is short, and the 3 bad ones, because of their inherent malignancy. This echo of Aristotle can also be found on the emphasis that is put on the role of institutions for the creation of virtuous citizens. In Aristotle, we found the idea that the compounds of the city, that is, its citizenry or the people, is influenced and influences the constitution, that is, the institutional setup of the state. And we see this emphasis not only in Machiavelli's Discourses, but also in The Prince, where he states that those who have seen princely rule don't know how to be free, and those who have previously been living in a republic will refuse to be dominated by a prince. And then for the prince, there are problems arising out of that. But this idea of compounds and institutions is important within Machiavelli as well. And then the idea seems to be the general lesson drawn from the discourses then can be said to create these right kind of institutions. It's better that they are founded by a single individual, yet for a city to prosper and grow, it needs its virtuous citizenry. This seems to be the core idea represented here. So why should this founding only be done by a single individual or a prince-like figure? On this we'll find in Book 1, Chapter 9, one should take it as a general rule that rarely, if ever, does it happen that a state, whether it be a republic or a kingdom, is either well ordered at the outset or radically transformed vis-a-vis its old institutions, unless this be done by one person. It is likewise essential that there should be but one person upon whose mind and method depends any similar process of organization. Wherefore the prudent organizer of the state, whose intention is to govern not in his own interest, but for the common good, and not the interest of his successors, but for the sake of his fatherland, which is common to all, should contrive to be alone in his authority. Nor will any reasonable man blame him for taking action, however extraordinary, which may be at the service in the organizing of a kingdom or constituting a republic. It is a sound maxim that reprehensible actions be justified by their effect, and that when the effect is good, as it was in the case of Romulus, it always justifies the action. For the man who uses violence to spoil things, not the man who uses it to mend things, is blameworthy. The idea presented here, and if we want to take this apart in the context of why a republic should be founded by just one person, or a kingdom should be founded by one person, is that it's most likely that this will be a single virtuous individual, and his constructing of a constitution should not be interfered with by lesser men and their opinions on these topics. A similar line of reasoning applies then to the risk of corruption and how single individuals should reset constitutions to their original principles. And on this topic of revitalization, we'll find in Book 3, Chapter 1, Machiavelli saying, I affirm that those changes make for their I affirm that those changes make for their conservation, which leads them back to their origins. The idea here seems to be that preservation of a well-structured society depends upon a revitalization of its founding principles. Later Republicans have continued this line of reasoning and arguing therefore that these founding principles or original principles constitute a higher form of law than the law which is normally made by the legislative power in a society. This must sound very familiar to you, as this higher law of original or founding principles is how we commonly understand institutions today, constitutions today. So when we speak of constitutions, we don't only refer to the institutional setup of a society, but also to the higher law which defines what a society or state looks like. Then he also comments here on the use of violence and his means to an end reasoning again. And the idea here is similar as what we have discussed. So the comment on Romulus using violence and killing his brother in the passage above should be understood in the light of the assertion made when discussing the prince, that good arises and comes out of evil. Even though Machiavelli places himself quite firmly into this Republican tradition, he also disagrees with a lot of the mainstream, some elements of the mainstream thinking, especially when it comes to class conflict. Machiavelli, even though being a proponent of a mixed constitution, thinks that class conflict is actually useful to a society. So remember that Aristotle favored his mixed constitution because he wanted to avoid or set it up in such a way that class conflict would not be a problem. You need to find harmony, a common way, and you have a strong middle class. Yet actually, in Machiavelli's thinking about this, indeed all social classes should have the ability to participate in politics, but not for the sake of harmony, but that their ambitions and striving against each other will drive the republic itself to glory and will maintain the fact that they will not give up their liberty. Remember that the drive to glory, for a city to prosper, you need a strong citizenry. And for him, this means using the ability and the class conflict so that no group will allow themselves to be dominated by another group. So he actually uses this conflict and thinks it's virtues. In this respect, Machiavelli was in favor also of ostracizing private citizens when they acted in such a way that was considered to be against the interest. Not only does this prevent people who hold a political office to overbear on their powers, but it also has a more pragmatic purpose of focusing the anger of a specific group of people, not towards the laws which make up the republic, but to that one individual which can then be eliminated. What is also contrary to a lot of people at this time, when we talk about class in Machiavelli, is that actually Machiavelli has a particular dislike for the wealthy class, or the patrician class if we talk about the history of Rome, and talks about the trustworthiness of the common people. And he actually says that the commoners, or the masses, when united and organized, are more virtuous than the nobles. This is an idea which we actually also find in the Prince, when he discusses whether the prince should build his principality on the humor of the masses or of the humor of the nobility. It's chapter 9 of the Prince. So, now that we have a general idea about his republicanism and theory of change in politics, let's also direct our attention in the discourses on Livy towards his idea of glory, how to beat fortune. His thinking on fortune in the discourses can be found in Book 3, Chapter 9, in which he said, "I have often thought that the reason why men are sometimes unfortunate and sometimes fortunate depends on whether their behavior is in conformity with time. For one sees that in what they do, some men are impetuous, others look about them and are cautious. And that is, since in both cases they go to extremes and are unable to go about things in the right way, in both cases they make mistakes." On the other hand, he is likely to make fewer mistakes and to prosper in his fortune when circumstances accord with his conduct, as I have said, and one always proceeds as the force of nature compels one to. We do here find a slightly different account of glory as in the prince. Because even though there is still an idea of mastering fortune, this does not give us the impression that mastering fortune extends into beating her or struggling with her. Or what we will find in the prince, that virtue is the friend of young men, for they are less cautious and more aggressive, and they command her with more audacity. Rather, fortune is still something to be mastered, but in the account in the discourses, this mastery can both be done by caution and impetus. So it's not necessarily that you have to delve into it harshly or rashly. But what is better, caution or impetus, seems to depend on what suits the given situation better. In this regard, Machiavelli also claims that republics have a better chance at mastering fortune than principalities, for the conduct of a republic is not dependent on the conduct of just a single man, for whom it's difficult to change his ways, right? Once you're habituated into a specific kind of behavior, it's very difficult to break that. But since the rule of a republic constitutes on the rule of a group of people, it has, if you want to view it that way, more conducts at its disposal. And therefore, it's easier to see what is fit or appropriate conduct given the situation or the political reality that the state finds itself in. This could lead us to claim, if we say that the achievement of glory is what in the end would be the goal or aim of a state, or what a state should strive for, that there is a pragmatic preference in Machiavelli for a republic over a principality. And that despite the quote from Harry Lime in The Third Man, which you also find in your problem description, that in Italy, for 30 years under the bourgeois, under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, and they had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The Cuckoo's Clock. Maybe, even despite the fact that Switzerland came up with the Cuckoo's Clock, a republic is still better at producing glory. Now we have completed our account of both books independently, and we've also referred back into a bit. But let's go back to this tale of two cities, or this what was initiated again by this quote from The Third Man. Is this task, or is Machiavelli really just telling two different stories? Are they just two different political entities, and he provides commentary on one in The Prince and commentary on the other in the Discourses? Or is there some way that we can unify his political thought? I'm not going to give you a definite answer to this, but I'll give you three ways of thinking about this, some of the criticisms, so that you can go on and make up your own mind. So, the first possibility is to say that Machiavelli is really a Republican, and that the prince should not be taken seriously, as it was dedicatory to Lorenzo de' Medici to excuse himself, Machiavelli, and find employment. So the prince would be an application letter that slightly polishes up the ideas that Machiavelli has about politics, which would be palpable and then made palpable to the ears of a ruler like Lorenzo. Therefore, you could state that the prince can be taken with a big grain of salt, and the discourses should be taken leading when trying to decipher what Machiavelli really thinks or really has to say about politics. However, in my opinion, there are multiple convincing reasons to reject this interpretation. So first of all, as we pointed out in the beginning of our discussion on the prince, This prince that's dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici is actually not the real subject of the prince. If it purely had to be a palpable piece of work, then why not glorify it and make it a work about him? Right? The subject of the prince is a new prince, not a customary one. Secondly, there are many ideas which are similar or both find expression in the Prince and Discourses. Therefore, it shows that at least some points Machiavelli was being honest and engaged into a fruitful reflection on politics within the Prince. And therefore, we should not take all of that with too much a grain of salt. Thirdly, as you'll see from the end of the Prince, and Machiavelli was a committed patriot or strived for a united Italy, there is this passionate plea for a prince, presumably being de' Medici, a passionate plea for asking a prince to unite Italy and make it great again. This passionate plea trying to incite someone to actually conquer a whole of Italy to make her great again, if you want to put it in Trump terms, seems kind of odd if it was not meant seriously. If you're not serious, you're not going to make a passionate plea, I think, to someone and ask them to conquer all of Italy and wage wars on republics, for instance, which this interpretation would seem that you would be more in favor of. So let's have a look at another possible interpretation. This interpretation says that there is a kind of unity between the texts as they outline one process, political process, which has two steps. So the discourses deal with a broader range of topics and not just republics, but also the process of regime change in general. Making this the dominant factor when interpreting both texts, so focusing on regime change, there is an argument to be made that the prince is necessary for the establishment of an ordered and unified state where before there is chaos and terror. So this process of creating a state should be done by a prince. And that's why we need to have a good prince. Where the second step would be, as outlined in the discourses, after the establishment of the state, that republican forces will take over and a republic will be established. These two texts thus provide the two necessary steps for the achievement what would then be Machiavelli's preferred form of government, which is a republic. The different accounts of fortune talked about earlier seems to give some probability to this, because we saw the claim that Machiavelli thinks it's easier for a republic to master fortune than a principality. So that position could also give some support for this line of reasoning. And the nice thing is that then there would be a consistency in Machiavelli's thinking. Yet also this interpretation of Machiavelli is not without problem. As said before, Machiavelli seems to hold the idea that the compounds in the constitution of a city inform each other and influence each other. And in The Prince, he gives a series of advice which actually creates a citizenry that is obedient. Right? He tells the prince how to instill fear within his dominion and make the citizens obedient rather than cultivating the civic virtues which are important for a republic. So if you do still think that compounds and institutions influence each other, why such a harsh insistence in the prince of banishing the civic virtues out of a principality when the eventual goal of this principality should be a takeover of the state by republican forces? The third interpretation that I want to introduce you to is to unite the two texts in one single, unified, normative framework which sees people as innovative and creative forces. In this case, the prince would be a treatise on how
a single individual can realize its full potential as a creative and innovative being. So the topic of the prince then would not just be somebody who is willing to become a new ruler, but somebody who wants to engage in his creative and innovative faculties as a human being to the largest extent possible. And then the other side of this is that the discourses would not have this treatise on self-realization to some extent, if you want to, as a individual subject, but describe a regime that could lead to the achievement of creativity and innovation at the level of a democratic collective. And therefore, it is a treatise on how the creative power in society can be shaped. This interpretation can be supported by some of the reflections on the concept virtue that we have gone through. So, as might be evident, there's no clear-cut answer to how to come to a unified interpretation of Machiavelli, and whether there is even one way of interpreting both texts. I would recommend you to reflect upon this yourself, read the text in combination with each other, see which elements you think are most important and which you want to focus on, and then decide whether you just see one of the two as dominant and interpret the other in the light of that, or treat them as two separate texts on separate political institutions. As always, I hope that you have enjoyed the lecture, and I wish you a pleasant continuation of your day. Bye bye.